Coming up on Cannabis Coast to Coast News with Alaina Pinto this week. Could this be the day that President Trump justifies cannabis as a medicinal product? All he has to do is sign his name on an executive order to start the process to reschedule or reclassify cannabis. Many reports say that decision is imminent and it could happen on Monday. Plus, High Times is reporting that American professional basketball player Jared Shaw will avoid punishment by death from the Indonesian government. Instead, he's sentenced to just 22 months for accepting a case of THC-infused gummies he uses to treat his pain from Crohn's disease in the mail. Reports are he could be released to the U.S. in 2027, if not sooner. And 9 years after voters approved social consumption lounges for adult use of cannabis in Massachusetts, the Cannabis Control Commission finally announces regulations for licenses. Curtis Emery has that story. In New York, that Office of Cannabis Management is looking for another new executive director as Governor Kathy Hochul asked for the resignation of their interim director, Felicia Reed. All that and more on Cannabis Coast to Coast News with Alaina Pinto next.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Cannabis Coast to Coast News, WPCM TV's weekly roundup in the fight to end cannabis prohibition. I'm Alaina Pinto. It's Monday, December 15th, but this could be the day that President Trump could sign an executive order to move cannabis off Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. This does not legalize it or even make it official, but it means that after almost 100 years of prohibition, the President of the United States recognizes the medicinal qualities of this plant and wants his Department of Justice and DEA to work towards regulations that will control the substance at the federal level. In 1970, then President Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act into law, and it started the war on drugs. And now medical research has learned so much about the various drugs on that controlled schedule 55 years later. And many think this should be rewritten to reflect on the knowledge we know now. Doctors wrote prescriptions for opioids that killed far too many people, while cannabis was aligned with heroin that has no medical applications, while thousands of people use cannabis for medicinal purposes. If and when this announcement is released, we will have a special report. But since it's been a week, months, or even years to have any movement on federal cannabis reform, this is a big deal for the industry. We start our coverage with Andrew Behringer.
I'm Andrew Behringer with the Washington, D.C. report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News, and pardon my voice. President Donald Trump is expected to take executive action that could fundamentally change federal cannabis policy in the United States. Since 1970, cannabis has been classified as a Schedule 1 controlled substance, the same category as heroin and LSD, meaning the federal government considers it to have, pardon the pun, high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. Now, after a pivotal December 10th meeting last week at the White House, Trump now plans to direct his administration to reclassify cannabis as a Schedule 3, acknowledging its medical benefits while maintaining some federal oversight. Now, however, the president cannot make this change by himself. Under federal law, Attorney General Pamela Bondi holds the authority to reschedule controlled substances, though this power is traditionally delegated to the DEA. Now, the rescheduling would also open doors for the FDA approval of more cannabinoid-based medicines and further legitimize the industry in states where cannabis is already legal. But it's critical to understand what rescheduling would not do. It would not legalize cannabis federally, would not decriminalize possession, would not solve banking access problems for the industry, and would not resolve conflicts between state and federal law in the 24 states where adult use is already legal. Now, the path forward faces many obstacles. House Speaker Mike Johnson has already voiced opposition, arguing studies don't support the move. Trump has several options. He could bypass the current administrative hearing process with an executive order, continue the Biden-era review that's been stalled since January a few years ago, or even kill the proposal entirely and maintain the status quo. Will he do an executive action or an executive order? Stay tuned and find out next week. Well, that's the Cannabis Report. I'm Andrew Behringer reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. See you next week.
So what about hemp, you ask? Well, that federal hemp ban amendment is still in place for November 2026, but there is already movement on both sides of the political aisle to rectify that. What this does more than anything else is to get rid of the dreaded 280E tax clause that has caused such distress in the industry. It also rights one of the unjust wrongs that was part of the reason why every cannabis business struggles. Think about it. Every other business in America can write off the cost of doing business by writing off regular business tax deductions. Cannabis businesses can't do that because of its Schedule 1 classification. That could change in as little as 1 month. And with more on the impact on the hemp industry is Kerry Hinkle with his weekly hemp report.
I'm Kimmie Hinkle with Bayou City Hemp out of Houston, Texas, and I'm back with another hemp report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This week, December 12th, after the Thanksgiving slowdown, a lot of folks at MJ Biz, all things in hemp and cannabis policy world are heating up at our nation's capital. Now, I'm sure other folks on this program will talk all about rescheduling and the implications that has on large MSO operators and those stock prices that are going through the roof today. But I'm going to keep our attention on hemp, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Senator Ron Wyden's Cannabinoid Safety and Regulation Act. Now, he unveiled that bill yesterday on December 11th. It would set up a 5 milligram per serving, 50 milligram per package of THC limit at the federal level. Beverages would be allowed to have 10 milligrams in a can. It would still keep intact states' rights. And so a state like Tennessee that has a higher milligram limit, that higher milligram limit would still apply, whereas a state like Virginia that has a lower hemp milligram limit on their THC products, that lower milligram would apply. But other states absent federal regulation, let's say a state like Texas that is tied to the Farm Bill definition, most in the industry think that that federal standard would then apply in that state, and the state would be able to raise or lower it depending on what the state would like to do. Keeping intact states' rights is going to be something that's very important for the Republican side of the aisle on this bill. But ultimately, it was introduced by 2 Oregon Democrats in a Republican-held Congress. So we know that this is a messaging and marking bill, meaning that with folks on the industry on Capitol Hill can say, as we push for a 12 or 18-month extension before the ban kicks in, that we need time to get a regulatory scheme right. And Ron Wyden's bill is a step in that right direction. So it's not going to pass both chambers and end up on President Trump's desk as is. Just like no bills go through the regular order anymore, you'll need to find some kind of must-pass piece of legislation to attach this to. But again, it's a step in the right direction as we go to the Hill again in January to find Republican leads on a bill like this, to say, look at the bare bones of what Ron Wyden does. Tell us what you like, what you don't. We'll rework this and reintroduce it with support from folks on the appropriate committees that are in the Republican leadership that can actually get something like this done. So at the same time of the madness of rescheduling and the craziness, I'm sure, that's going to follow that news, the hemp industry still has their head down to extend the ban and pass some regulatory guidance at the federal level for the low dose part of this plan. So again, I'm Kerry Hinkle with Bayou City Hemp, and this was my hemp report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'll see you again next week.
Next up, a relatively happy ending for an American basketball player playing in Indonesia. His name is Jared Shaw. You might remember that 7 months ago, the 35-year-old from Texas was busted for a delivery of THC gummies from Thailand. Shaw suffers from Crohn's disease and has been an outspoken proponent of its effects on his painful condition. However, Indonesia is probably one of the worst countries to be busted in, since they have the death penalty on their books for trafficking narcotics. An Indonesian judge this week sentenced Shaw to 26 months in prison, which sounds like a lot better than facing a firing squad. High Times broke this story, but shared no word on whether the 7 months Shaw has already served will count towards that sentence. High Times talked with the international humanitarian and justice advocate named Dante West, who negotiated the sentence with the Indonesian Justice Department. All are hopeful he will be home with his family in 2027 at the latest. Now we move on to our state reports, and there was some good news from the state of Massachusetts, where the Cannabis Control Commission announced their rules about social consumption lounges, something that was part of the original ballot question in 2016. Here's Curtis Emery with more in his Bay State Cannabis Report.
I'm Curtis Emery, a bud tender from Resonate in Worcester, Massachusetts, with the Bay State Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. The wait is finally over here in Massachusetts as the state announced that social consumption lounges will officially be coming to Massachusetts. Yes, the wait is over. It's been 9 years since social consumption lounges started off as a ballot initiative. Now it is a reality here in the Bay State, and we look forward to enjoying this new freedom. These social consumption lounges will be available for a variety of different entities offering safe social consumption of cannabis. The emphasis here will be on community socializing, but it will also maintain strict safety guidelines and a variety of safeguards in place to make sure that it goes off without a hitch. Excited to see where this leads us as a state. We were the first state on the East Coast to open a dispensary. Now we'll be the first state on the East Coast to have a social consumption lounge. You can't be more proud of that. Also in the news, the CCC is reaffirming their commitment to cracking down on bad actors in the cannabis space. This week, they went into great detail about a secret shopper program, which they hope to recommit to and make sure is in full force going forward next year. The goal of this task force would be to address a couple of concerns, one being THC inflation in the state and another being high counts of mold and mildew in products and incorrect or illegal reporting from independent testing labs here in Massachusetts. I've been Curtis Emery with the Bay State Report, Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
More good news from the cannabis industry as another state opens its first medical dispensary. That state is Kentucky. Their governor, Andy Beshear, has been spearheading the movement to get their medical program launched. And now the store called The Post in Ohio County opened its doors this past weekend. That store was selling the first batch of licensed legal cannabis grown by the first licensed cultivator farm, Tucky. If you are watching this from Kentucky and have your medical card, you better get there early. The Post is limited to only one legal licensed farm right now, and inventory is scarce. Well, now let's check in with Karen Black in Arizona.
I'm Karen Black from Greenfinger Consulting with the Arizona Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Arizona's cannabis market continues to cool off, even as it keeps pouring money into state coffers. New data shows November sales came in at about $86 to $87 million, continuing a double-digit year-over-year decline and extending a trend of price compression and softer demand across most product categories. At the same time, the Department of Revenue reports cannabis taxes have already topped roughly $255 million this year on more than $1 billion in combined medical and adult use sales, with November alone bringing in around $22 million in tax revenue, despite the slowdown. Against that backdrop, child safety advocates are putting new pressure on Arizona lawmakers to crack down on how THC products reach kids. Even with a federal ban coming for most intoxicating hemp products, these groups want a state law that tightens packaging, marketing, and potency rules for edibles and vapes and closes loopholes that let teens buy THC at smoke shops and convenience stores. Speaking of safety, law enforcement in Arizona's rural counties are still seeing big illegal drug trafficking cases. In Gila County, the sheriff's office reported a significant drug seizure near Payson, part of an ongoing push against highway and small-town trafficking corridors in Rim Country. And statewide, the Department of Public Safety says troopers seized more than 400 pounds of methamphetamine in a single day during early December traffic stops, underscoring just how much product is still moving through Arizona's roads despite repeated high-profile busts. And there is some good news to close out this week's report. In Phoenix, the Modern Elder Collective Wellness Expo gave Arizona seniors a safe, science-based introduction to cannabis, with doctors and educators walking folks through how THC and CBD work, how to read labels, and how to shop dispensaries with confidence. And in the East Valley, Ponderosa Dispensary opened a new location in Tempe Mesa, rounding out its footprints across the major metros and making it a little easier for consumers in that corridor to find a neighborhood shop. That's all for this week's Arizona Report. I'm Karen Black from Greenfinger Consulting reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
In the past week, New York Governor Kathy Hochul asked for the resignation of the head of Office of Cannabis Management, Felicia Reed. There was another executive change at the OCM when Deputy Counsel James Rogers was fired. He had been involved in an investigation with a company called Omnium on compliance violations. That trial was supposed to start this week and has been dismissed. Instead, OCM leaders is changing again. Chief Administration Officer Susan Filburn will take over the duties of the executive director. Governor Hochul issued this statement of explanation, quote, "Too often, the Office of Cannabis Management, has stood in the way of the market realizing its potential, including most recently in the case of a pending compliance action that it has had to withdraw," unquote. No such issues in Virginia, at least not for now, but there will be some changes in that state. Here's Joe Parsons in the Cavalier Commonwealth.
I'm Joe Parsons with the Virginia Cannabis Connection from Higher Education's Coffee Talk, sponsored by 97.5 through WV, and reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. The final meeting of the Joint Commission to oversee the transition of the Commonwealth to a retail market was held in Richmond, and it was the last meeting before the final draft of the 2026 Adult Use Cannabis Bill goes before the House and Senate. The meeting was led by Representative Paul Kryzak. And this meeting focused on all the changes made to this year's cannabis bill, and it allowed for industry leaders and the general public to weigh in on some of the latest changes.
So we have, over the past few months, our commission has worked very diligently to review existing law and develop a bill that will not only establish a much-needed adult use retail market here in Virginia, but also reflect what Virginians want it to be. And we've listened to you. And today we are not actually unveiling the actual bill because there's still a lot of tweaking going on. And you're going to hear that we aren't all 100% on the same page here. We've got some things that we still need to work on, and we're going to continue to do so. And at the end of this meeting, you're going to have an opportunity to also weigh in as we've had at every single one of our meetings.
Hello, Mr. Chair, and to the Commission. Thank you. My name is Chelsea Higgs-Wise with Marijuana Justice. I just want to say thank you so much for your hard work on these recommendations. It adds transparency and opportunity for Virginia. We will continue to say that we're worried about the early start that November 1 might provide, and just a realistic train of events that CCA may not be able to hire, train, and implement the staff needed for the November 1 date. And so therefore, if the micros and the hemp conversions are not ready, even by November 1, it would only be the medical folks that are there and able to sell. Our suggestion is from the matrix to tie number 51 to number 50. And that would say that our November 1 start date would be a go as long as these other operators are certified and ready to go as well, because there could be a holdup that is not their own fault. Also, just wanted to speak on number 25 about the shelf space. It's my understanding, as we've seen across the country, that it can be a pay-to-play on shelf space, and that what can happen is it ends up disproportionately hurting small businesses and farmers that just come in on their hustle and hard work of a product, and they're not able to then basically pay to play for shelf space. And that's why we put that protection in the regulation. I also want to say I agree with Senator Eben about the ABC. We fought really hard for the CCA, but unfortunately I do disagree. I believe that we should look at the farmers market study to see how we can do that in a way that protects our communities, but also provides
Thank you. Your time is up.
Thank you.
Out of the over 50 new additions, most were a welcome change and got more praise than apprehension. However, while the idea of consumption lounges was met with public embrace, the public marketplace events were not. We await what the final bill has to offer, and this time, if we can get the bill passed through the House and Senate like we have for the last 2 years, it will finally get signed into law by our new governor. and enact the will of the people and take a big bite out of that deadly illegal market. Well, that's going to do it for this week from Higher Education's Coffee Talk in Charlottesville, Virginia. And as always, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News, I'm Joe Parsons. Until next time, stay lifted.
That'll do it for the A Block, our first section of our news this week. And next up, we'll tell you about another huge bust in California. And then Amie Carter has a tribute to a friend and advocate who passed away last week. Cannabis Coast to Coast News continues after this.
Your cannabis business could be overpaying by hundreds of thousands of dollars in federal income taxes because of one simple assumption that you're making about your accountant. A dispensary owner in Colorado called me frustrated as hell. He'd been working with the same accountant for 3 years. His accountant said, "What's 471C?" Here's what the ignorance of that accountant was costing this business owner. $180,000 every single year for 3 years. 471C has been around since 2017. We're talking about an 8-year-old tax provision that many cannabis CPAs don't fully understand. 471C is one of the most complex and highly debated tax strategies in the cannabis industry. If you want to make sure you're not leaving any money on the table, I'm offering free 471C reviews this month. Link in the description.
Accounting Buds has grown into Buds Group, the same award-winning quality, now with more service offerings. Buds Group, your best buds in the biz.
Looking for PR that over-delivers on expectations? At Maverick Public Relations, they pair big agency experience with personalized attention. From launching award-winning brands to securing top-tier media hits, their data-driven communications team helps visionary leaders and entrepreneurs rise above the media noise. Maverick PR is responsive, collaborative, and relentless about results and ROI. Visit themaverickpr.com and make headlines together.
If you want to make history, if you want to be part of history, if you want to say you helped legalize marijuana in America, now is the time to join us.
Welcome back to the B Block, our second section of Cannabis Coast to Coast News for this week. I'm Alaina Pinto. California continues to crack down on the illegal grow and sales in that state, and Governor Gavin Newsom's Unified Cannabis Enforcement Task Force, or the UCETF, executed the raid on operations in Alameda and LA counties. Their haul, 58,350 plants were confiscated. That amount of weed is worth $57 million in the illicit or legacy market. Now let's check with Amie Carter in Michigan, where that state is preparing for a 24% increase in wholesale taxes that will kick in on January 1st. On top of that, one of that state's longest advocates lost her battle with cancer, and Amie has a special tribute to her friend, Susan Fisher.
I'm Amie Carter with Michigan Weedsters for this week's Michigan Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. A special recognition goes to Michigan Cannapros for hosting the successful Michigan State Takeover at MJ BizCon in Las Vegas, Nevada. As the event connected cannabis leaders from across the state, longtime advocate Daryl Starvos, co-owner of Michigan's first dispensary, shared his perspective on the industry's future, notably voicing concern over the newly proposed 24% wholesale tax and its potential negative impact on both businesses and consumers. You may have heard the news. The judge in the case regarding that 24% wholesale tax on cannabis denied the plaintiff's request for a preliminary injunction. The new law will therefore go into effect on January 1st, but the fight is not over yet. The court has set a date to resume proceedings in January. We pause today to remember and celebrate a true light in our community. Susan Elizabeth Fisher, who passed away last week after battling her fight with cancer. Susan was much more than a friend to many of us. She was a fierce advocate whose bravery inspired everyone she met. She taught the greatest lesson, to enjoy life and fight for what's right, no matter what the challenge. In the advocacy community, Susan was known for her tireless work, going as far as to testify in front of the state legislature for cannabis rights. She was a witty, observant, and beautiful soul who was always the first to speak up when something needed to be said. Outside of advocacy, Susan was an esteemed teacher for over 15 years, supporting countless students during her 11 years at McKinley Middle School in Flint. She faced life with a remarkable grit and humor, even throughout her long illness, always advocating for herself and others, navigating hardship. Susan, thank you for showing all of us how to truly live life. Your advocacy and your feisty personality, your light will continue to inspire us every day. To know Susan was to know joy and courage. We send our deepest condolences to her family and all who were lucky enough to walk alongside that incredible light. That's it for this week. I'm Amie Carter with Michigan Weedsters for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
As Texas continues to see how the new regulations on hemp will impact the industry, the medical cannabis laws also are changing. And so, with the expectations of more people in their medical program, the state has to prepare for the increase in demand now and will be available for more medical conditions. Texas originally is one of the state's biggest licensed cultivators with a 7,700 square foot facility. They are increasing their capacity to 75,000 square feet, and the facility includes a hybrid greenhouse for plant cultivation where the first sun-grown cannabis was recently harvested in the state. Now, Texas Original will also have manufacturing labs, processing and refining, as well as testing labs, packaging, and dispensing. Just north of Texas is Oklahoma, where Kimmie Cannabis is proud of how her state is stepping up their charitable giving during this holiday season.
I am Kimmie Cannabis from Canna Talk About It with your Oklahoma Cannabis Report from Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Oklahoma-based processor Pharmacated has been temporarily shut down following an inspection by the Oklahoma Medical Marijuana Authority at its Eufaula facility. OMMA issued an emergency suspension while it reviews reporting discrepancies within the state's tracking system. According to the owners, this action is administrative in nature and not related to product safety. Pharmacated says there has been no allegations of contamination, unsafe products, or any risk to patients. All product on site is currently on hold while the matter is reviewed. The company says the issue involves how certain inventory and batch data were entered or categorized in metric. Pharmacated is fully cooperating with OMMA, has requested a hearing, and is working with its compliance team and legal counsel to resolve the situation as quickly as possible. The owners stress this is a challenge, not a crisis, and reaffirm their commitment to transparency and quality. In other news, despite mounting pressure on Oklahoma's cannabis industry, many businesses continue to show up for their communities. The High and Hills Garden Club is collecting items to support Hope for the Future and Hoop Dads, organizations making a real impact for families and youth across the state. The event is on December 20th at the OKC Healers Co-op and will include a high tea terpene tasting, DIY gift crafting, and a strong focus on community care. Organizers also want the public to know that you can donate directly to Hope for the Future and Hoop Dads, ensuring support reaches those organizations even if you can't attend in person. It's another example of how cannabis companies across Oklahoma continue to give back even in challenging times. That's it from Oklahoma. I'm Kimmie Cannabis, peace, love, and all that good stuff.
I am Jenny Germano with ICS Consulting. This is the Colorado Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Colorado's legal cannabis market is ending 2025 on a historic note, but not in a way the industry had hoped. New state data shows cannabis prices have fallen to the lowest levels on record, underscoring ongoing challenges for growers and retailers across the state. According to the latest figures from the Colorado Marijuana Enforcement Division, the median wholesale price for a pound of cannabis flower now just sits at $648, a dollar below the previous record low. That marks yet another drop for a long trend of declining prices that have weighed heavily on producers and dispensaries alike. While Colorado once saw booming sales and robust pricing, with wholesale flower topping more than $1,700 per pound back in 2021, the market has steadily contracted. Growers have closed their doors in significant numbers, with licensed cultivation operations down sharply over the past several years. Industry observers say these lower prices reflect a wider pullback in demand and oversupply conditions, even as some smaller players exit the market. With margins tightening, cannabis businesses have struggled to stay profitable, and several well-known brands and dispensaries have either shut down or sold off their assets. At the same time, new stores continue to open in some communities, particularly in the areas recently embraced recreational sales. But many in the industry, these openings have not been enough to offset the broader declines in sales volume and wholesale revenue. Business analysts are watching closely to see whether continued price drops may push more growers out of the market and how federal policy changes could impact Colorado's cannabis economy going into 2026. That's the latest on Colorado's cannabis pricing landscape, a market in flux as the year comes to a close. I am Jenny Germano with ICS Consulting, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
Now let's turn to the state of Florida, where there always seems to be a battle with the plant. Smart and safe, Florida continues to lead the reform charge, and they are constantly fighting in court or with the governor about just about anything. Still, that state has more medical patients than any other state. At least, check it now, it is 930,000. And now Senator has introduced a bill to allow patients to grow their medicine at home. Senator Carlos Guillermo Smith wants to offer the right to home grow for qualified patients, and now the fight begins in that state house. Well, now let's check in with what's going on in the so-called marijuana state of Colorado. Here's Jenny Germano. In Ohio, the SB 56 bill that had been debated, changed, and feared, charged, changed, debated, changed, and feared, got it. In Ohio, the SB 56 bill that had been debated, changed, and feared has passed, and it is on its way to Governor Mike DeWine's desk. Once again, no matter the result from another ballot initiative dictating the change in laws in states has been rolled back by the legislature, and now it will be a crime to bring out of state legal cannabis into Ohio. With rescheduling soon to be resurrected thanks to the imminent executive directive by President Trump, Nevada Congresswoman Dina Titus is in a position of power. Tina Tasaka explains how her congresswoman is ready to impact real change beyond just changing the plant's classification. When it comes to Nevada, we always check in with Tina Tasaka.
I'm Tina Tasaka with 420 Technologies and Iconic Representation, and this is the Nevada and Tribal Nations Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. U.S. Representative, 1st Congressional District of Nevada, Dina Titus, was appointed as the co-chair of the bipartisan Congressional Cannabis Caucus in January 2025. Recently, she appeared in a 4-minute video to her constituents to outline her platform that include for cannabis businesses to secure tax breaks, support the Safe Banking Act and traditional banking services, allow for veterans to access cannabis for treatment through the VA, and for universities and researchers to be protected as they study various cannabis elements without risk. Ms. Titus is also the original co-sponsor of the bipartisan States 2.0 Act, advocating to protect state and tribal cannabis laws from federal interference and modernize federal marijuana policy. Here's Dina Titus.
Hello, I'm Dina Titus, and I represent the 1st Congressional District of Nevada. Thank you to the Las Vegas Medical Marijuana Association and your president, John Lobb, for organizing this important meeting and for working with me over many years. I wish I could be there in person, but it's an honor to speak to you all virtually to discuss my work as the Democratic co-chair of the Cannabis Caucus. Although I may be fairly new as co-chair of the caucus, I have long been on the front lines of the fight to legalize cannabis and to reduce the harms that the criminalization of marijuana has brought to so many. As part of my efforts in Congress, I recently introduced the Evidence-Based Drug Policy Act. That act would remove outdated restrictions on the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Currently, the office and its director aren't allowed to sponsor research related to any Schedule I drug. Furthermore, the director must, by law, actively oppose the legalization of any substance that's Schedule I and not approved by the FDA. Those prohibitions are really absurd. Cannabis is legal for adult use in 24 states and for medical use in 40 states, and 70% of the public supports legalizing the use of marijuana. The current policy that prohibits even public policy research or study into the effectiveness of current state programs is just not realistic. The Director of National Drug Control Policy should be able to speak honestly and be informed by research about cannabis. Passing my bill would be a meaningful step to get rid of the stigma against regulated cannabis at the federal level, like at the states. Another bill I introduced was the States 2.0 Act with Congressman Joyce, who's my Cannabis Caucus co-chair. This bill would get the federal government out of the way of states that have chosen to legalize cannabis and enact a federal framework for cannabis use. Now, in addition, I'm proud to soon reintroduce 2 other cannabis reform bills. One is the Safe Banking Act, which would allow state legal cannabis businesses access to traditional financial services. And it would provide safe harbor protections to financial institutions, lenders, insurers, and others who serve the industry, ensuring that they're not penalized for offering services to cannabis businesses like now. The other is called the Higher Education Marijuana Research Act, which would eliminate obstacles to the academic research of cannabis. It would protect universities and researchers who study it, and it would thus promote the responsible study of marijuana. While progress has seemingly stalled at the executive branch, comprehensive change will have to come from Congress. We need to, as I say, puff, pass the bills to legalize cannabis, remove criminal penalties for cannabis use, bring the federal government into the 21st century, and ensure that cannabis consumers, employees, and researchers are all protected. Now, the president can act without Congress by using his constitutional authority to pardon individuals and commute sentences, for people who have been negatively impacted by the war on drugs. I urge the president to continue the rescheduling process also. At the minimum, he could do that like he promised during the campaign in Florida. Rescheduling is an important step that will enable marijuana businesses to take advantage of normal business tax deductions, and it will alleviate disproportionate tax burdens inflicting the industry. They'll be just like any other small business. So I want to thank you again, the Las Vegas Medical Marijuana Association, for the important work that you do educating and advocating. So know that I'll continue fighting until cannabis is legalized, till no one's in prison for cannabis use, and the federal government ends its much outdated policy that slows research, harms individuals, and hurts legal businesses. I look forward to continuing to work together to promote cannabis reform. And as always, don't hesitate to reach out if I or my staff can be of any assistance. Stop by and see us in Washington or here in Las Vegas. Thank you so much.
Former Navajo Nation political candidate and businessman pleaded guilty in federal court to multiple felonies tied to a massive illegal marijuana and hemp operation on and near Navajo Nation land. Prosecutors say he ran dozens of illegal farms across hundreds of acres growing marijuana despite tribal laws prohibiting both commercial marijuana and hemp. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, Benally pleaded guilty to 15 federal charges, including drug trafficking conspiracy, manufacturing and intent to distribute large quantities of cannabis, environmental crimes involving illegal pollution of the San Juan River, firearms offenses, employing undocumented workers, and smuggling illegal pesticides. The Arizona Republic reports his sentencing is set for December 23rd, 2025, where he faces a mandatory minimum of 15 years in prison, up to life, plus possible fines and supervised release. That's it for the Nevada highlights and tribal nations. I'm Tina Tasaka with 420 Technologies and Iconic Representation for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
So with all this talk about rescheduling the stock market, which loves rumor and scuttlebutt, watch cannabis stocks go up with the media reports of President Trump's executive decision to back the rescheduling of cannabis. Here's Doug Miller, who is always high on Wall Street.
I'm Doug Miller from High on Wall Street with this week's Cannabis Stock Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Big moves are hitting the cannabis sector tonight, and this one could reshape the entire U.S. marijuana market. Reports broke out today online that President Trump is preparing an executive order directing federal agencies to reclassify cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 under the Controlled Substance Act. If this goes through, it's a huge shift because Schedule 3 classification formally recognizes marijuana's accepted medical use and a lower potential for abuse. But even bigger than that, it would unlock tax relief the industry has been begging for. Right now, cannabis industries can't deduct ordinary business expenses because of federal tax code section 280E. That single rule has crushed profitability for years. A move to Schedule 3 would eliminate 280E entirely, instantly improving margins, cash flow, and valuations across the board. The sector exploded in the after-hours trading. MSOS, Tilray, Canopy Growth, and others surged. MSOS went up 39% from $3.76 to $5.26 in the after-hours and expected to run more if Trump announces this news. And that's this week's Cannabis Stock Report. Reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News, I'm Doug Miller.
And finally tonight, a strange story out of South Carolina. If you ever wondered how contraband gets into the hands of prisoners who are locked up behind bars, the story might shock you. In a prison in Bishopville, South Carolina, a drone delivery was discovered by prison guards. Food like steak and crabs was found in this delivery, as was cannabis. Needless to say, the drone never connected with the prisoner who ordered it, and the guards enjoyed a good meal. No word on whatever happened to that cannabis. We know it wasn't for dessert, but at least the guards had a good meal. That will do it for this week's Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Alaina Pinto. Remember, it's a whole new world of weed out there. Educate yourself and consume responsibly. We will see you next week.
I think I messed up. Did you know there's a place that covers all the cannabis news you need? Pro Cannabis Media is now WPCM TV, your go-to website for things cannabis. WPCM TV is the CNBC of weed, bringing you the latest news you need.
Amie Carter. This week, she reports from inside the State House in Lansing.
I'm Amie Carter from Michigan Weedsters with this week's Michigan Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
And talk shows about all things cannabis.
Well, thank you, and thank you for all you're doing to get the word out. Like, this show is so important.
It all started back in 2018 when Emmy award-winning talk show host Jimmy Young kicked it off with the In the Weeds podcast.
That it's not just
any generic paper towel, you do have a brand that you use, right?
Yeah, we live or die by the bounty. I mean,
the quicker picker upper. I love that.
His mission? Building an army of multimedia journalists and podcast hosts who are documenting the fight to end cannabis prohibition in this country and around the world. Fast forward to today, and we've got the nation's only weekly cannabis coast-to-coast news program with Alaina Pinto.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's Cannabis Coast to Coast News, WPCM TV's weekly production of the fight to end cannabis prohibition in this country and around the world. I'm Alaina Pinto.
Delivering the nation's only TV news-style program. Since June 2021, WPCM TV has racked up over 1.3 million views with 17 million impressions and picked up over 16,000 subscribers on YouTube alone. For more information, contact the team at WPCMTV.com